Good.
Okay, let me just get this on the record that Jerry Kelly is one of the best book designers in the English-speaking world and an expert on calligraphy and typography. Welcome back once again, Jerry, to the Bibliophiles. Great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Nigel. It's a pleasure to be back again.
So I just posed you a question that you've had to answer many, many times about what to do with a manuscript. If someone's got a manuscript and they're just toying with the options in terms of producing a book and distributing it and selling it, and so maybe you could put it on automatic pilot, as you said.
Yes, you brought up three possibilities. Maybe repeat those and I'll respond.
Very good. Okay, so we have a manuscript, let's say. We've edited it, we're ready to go with it. So three possibilities then. There's one, to use a company like Amazon to basically just take care of your everything, printing, distribution, marketing, whatever. Second one is to use a company like yours, assuming you're not booked up for the next 25 years, which I bet you are.
Never happened in my life. Always have room for another project.
Which basically would be, you're going to create a beautiful, beautiful book for someone. But then there's the question of, well, what about the rest of it? And then finally, there's the option of approaching a traditional publishing house and getting rejected 100 times, but maybe at one of those pitches will succeed. So there we have it.
Right. And it's a question that comes up often, that I hear often. So I have experience with this scenario. I'm going to take the middle possibility first, where you mentioned that I could produce, hopefully, a good-looking book. And what I often like to say is that you give me pictures and text, or someone gives me pictures and text, and I give you a book. That's my specialty. I'm actually a book designer at heart, but I got into book design. I got into professional book design mainly through two printing companies that I worked for almost 20 years. So for a lot of my clients, I got involved in producing the book too, printing it. And there are certain skills with that are needed to get a book produced properly. But also for a lot of people, a lot of small institutions, companies, one-stop shopping is a plus for them, that they don't have to hire a production person. They don't have to hire a typesetter, a printer, a binder, and a designer. That you give me pictures and text, I give you books. About 85%, I would say, of my work is that. 15% maybe for publishers or larger institutions who have a production staff and a relationship with vendors and a workflow, that they would handle that, and I just give them the print-ready files. You give me pictures and text, I give you books. But everything before that and everything after that, I do not do. So when it comes to editorial or photography, I don't handle that. I could recommend sources, but I do not get involved. A customer should give me print-ready text. Of course, it will be proofread, and there will be the chance to make changes, and print quality photography. And after that, once the books are produced, I don't get involved in distribution. I will do what they call fulfillment, which is if I get a mailing list, an Excel spreadsheet with a mailing list, I will have a mailing house send out those orders. But I do not do what a traditional publisher does once they get printed books, which is promote them and send them out. So when it comes to print on demand or really traditional publishing or distribution, that's not something I do. So, for a lot of people, they'd rather go the Amazon route, although the chances of success are not great. But, it has happened.
What do you mean the chances of success?
The chances of getting very wide, of putting your book on Amazon and having 1,000 people order it, because your book is wonderful, which it may very well be, are not great, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
So I hope I covered the second scenario you said about my making the book. Because I'm going to go to the third scenario next about approaching a publisher. And that is a long shot too, unfortunately. Publishers are reluctant, I think, to take on an unknown quantity. Every publisher wants to publish a book on the Pope's sex life, written by the Pope, or, Clinton's memoirs, or Michelle Obama's memoirs. These are the sure things. Publishing is a very risky business. Publishers are very risk averse, and you put the two together, and they don't take on many projects. There are classic examples of this. Classic. The great one that I always like to refer to is the fact, this is not some hearsay, that a certain author had a book unpublished, never published a book before, had a book, brought it to 41 publishers who rejected the book. The 42nd publisher was a bit off the beaten track for the kind of book this author had. And this publisher took it on, even though it wasn't their kind of book. And it became a success. The name of that author is J.K. Rowling. The name of the book was Harry Potter. And what was it? The Sorcerer's Stone? Was that the first? Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone? I can't recall. The 41 main publishers who should do that book, who do young adult children's books, rejected it. Finally, it was Scholastic that published it.
Jerry, that's in the States.
In the States. In the States, right. She's British.
Yeah.
And look, there are other examples. I actually can't recall them, but I've heard other examples of books you just wouldn't believe how important they became that were rejected by multiple publishers. So the chances of Nigel Beale having, the next Moby Dick and getting it published. Moby Dick, by the way, was an example. Moby Dick.
That's a good one. Yeah.
The point is, publishers, their whole game is trying to figure out what will sell, and they're not. And look, it's like beating the stock market. That's what they're trying to do.
Yes.
They're trying to predict the future, and that's not easy. But there are some people who do get published, so it's not hopeless, but it's a long shot. It's a long shot, and a lot of great books. And God knows how many books there are that never got published, never saw the light of day, that would have been the next Harry Potter or the Fountainhead that we will never know about. So that's options 2 and 3. In the old days, I have a book now, Nigel. I'm going to digress a little. I am working on a book, just like this is a project like you're talking about, where I am designing and having printed a book. I'm not going to tell you what it is or who the client is, but I'll give you.
Can you tell me after?
Personally, yes, as long as you promise not to spill the beans, because I don't want to stick my nose into the person's business.
Yeah.
I read this book. I think it's fantastic. It should be published by some mainstream, and it's an author who has been the writer who's dead. The guy who's coming to me is actually a small publisher. The writer who's dead had written this book that was never published, and now this small publisher is publishing it in a very small edition. It is fantastic. This is a book that should be with a mainstream publisher, should become a million seller, in my opinion. I'm not a publisher. And in the old days, it just missed. In the old days, I would get on the phone and call David Godine. Have you ever interviewed David Godine?
I have. I interviewed him on the 40th anniversary of his publishing house,
which was 10 years ago. And he's done a wonderful book. Have you seen the book on his? You've got to get it. It's sold out, been reprinted. Godine at 50. It's called Godine at 50. I could get on the phone to David, and he would publish a lot of these books that I thought were worthwhile, that were subsidized most of the time. That helps. But now I can't think of a publisher to call about this book. It's because I have some art book. I've actually done this with another author I work with. He had a book on architecture, 2 books, and I called the publisher and got it. That I knew and got it. So art books, I have some connection, even though, believe me, it's not that close. But this other author, not the book that I am now working on, this other author wrote a couple of good books, couldn't get them published, didn't have a publisher, even though he was a published author too. The publishers who worked with him weren't doing his kind of book anymore. And I had some connections in the art book world that published his books and did all right. David, I'll tell you one of my favorite stories, but this may be an aside too, but a few years ago, and now I will get specific, I did some work for the Greenwood Cemetery, which is actually a wonderful cultural institution in Brooklyn, where the president of Greenwood wanted to turn this cemetery into a cultural institution. And he did. He has concerts there. He has plays performed there, art exhibitions there. And part of this was publishing a book every now and then about some resident or residents of Greenwood who, as they called them, permanent residents. And someone would write a book and they do it. And, I did 2 or 3 books for them. And they came to me with a book by a fellow named Tom Gilbert, who, wrote some sports articles for journals. He wrote a biography of Roberto Clemente, also the baseball player, was very interested in baseball. Baseball, as you may or may not know, started in Brooklyn and New York, where they were the rival teams, Brooklyn going across the river and sometimes playing in New Jersey. And this fellow wrote a book because a lot of the earliest baseball players who became stars, which then meant that maybe a few thousand people came to see the game and paid nothing and just stood around, are buried at Greenwood. A lot. They were doctors and Wall Street brokers and lawyers who played baseball on the side, and some became professional, but that was very rare. And a lot of them were buried at Greenwood. And this fellow Tom Gilbert lives in Brooklyn, and he did this book on the early history of baseball, the very beginnings of baseball. I thought this was fantastic. Also, I read because there's so many myths. Of course, Abner Doubleday, not true that he started baseball. And this book that Tom Gilbert had written, I read it. I felt it answered a lot of questions. There are a lot unanswered questions, but it spelled it all out. I thought this book was fantastic. So I called up Godine and I said to David, David, you want a book that'll sell 20,000 copies? And he laughed. He said, yeah, tell me more. He laughed like, would we like a book that sells 20,000 copies? Most of their runs don't reach that. So he took the book on. And he liked it too. It's a wonderfully written book. Tom Gilbert is a wonderful author. And last I heard, it was just below 20,000 copies. It was right there.
Jerry, you'd make a good publisher.
No, I make a terrible publisher because actually, for those 2 stories, I could tell you other stories about where I thought a book was great and the publisher couldn't sell it. I could tell you stories like that. But these 2, the new one, the one that I'm working on now, I can't think of anybody to call. It's a very off the beaten track book, to put it mildly. It's the writing is very quirky but wonderful. But the point is, this fellow I do work for, who actually has a small publishing company where he does 1 or 2, and he actually sells. He has a certain niche. I don't want to get too specific because I feel it's his privacy rights, but it's a wonderful book. But and I'm making the book, and it's going to be a nice book. He thinks that, and I think that. And he's doing a very small edition, and he'll sell some.
Well, here's my question then. So we hand it over to you. You make a book out of it. Is there someone that you can then hand it over to do all the extra stuff, the distribution,
that's what I'm trying to say. My answer is no. There are places that do that. I'll tell you a story and it relates to this directly, but it's a man came to me. He was an English professor at Vassar. He's an English professor at Vassar. And he believes that he has discovered the boy that Shakespeare wrote the sonnets to. It's kind of become established that Shakespeare bringing these to a boy that he was maybe perhaps infatuated with.
Southampton or something?
Well, the Earl of Southampton is one of the candidates proposed as that person. This fellow, who, he's an English professor. He's got credentials, at a major institution. And he believes through research that he found, this will relate, believe it or not, to your question. He's done research that he found this boy. And he wanted a book done on it. And I don't know what he did before he came to me. I don't know what publishers he may have approached. But he came to me to do a book. And it was an expensive project because it was a hardcover book, maybe 300 pages, with some color illustrations because there were paintings of this candidate that he proposed. I think there may have even been a painting of the Earl of Southampton also. And we did this book. That was actually a very nice book. And the way this relates, he had identified someone in upstate New York, I believe, a woman who ran a business that took it over. I can't recall her name. It may be in my records. Did a business that took over this distribution of this book once it was done. I shipped the books to her. a big part of what publishers do is promotion, is sending out review copies,
yes.
trying to get the books noticed. So she took it over. So she did what you're saying. I can't remember her name. It may be in my records, but I'm sure there are people out there who did it. But I will say that we were having a conversation once, and she said to me, "Do you know where the money for this book came from?" And I did not. And I must admit, I would have loved to have known. It was a curiosity that, English professors don't do color illustrated hardcover books with dust jackets or maybe they do. And give me a call. It turns out that this English professor was Meryl Streep's drama teacher, and that she credits him with getting her interested in theater. And the rest is history, as they say. I won't go into details. So she's very grateful to this person.
So wait a sec. So she said, "I'm going to pay for this book for you"?
From what I heard from this distributor, that's where I'm sure she's in touch with this teacher who had.
Nice.
Yeah, it is nice.
What I would like to do is, after you tell the next story, is to get an idea of what something like what I want to do would cost.
Yes, good. Yes, because I'm actually prepared a little for that. Okay. Yes, and that often comes up, that subject, and again, like I have a fairly standard answer for people who say, "I'm going to self-publish. What should I do?" The next story, just quickly, is that when Rocky Steinauer got an honorary degree from Dartmouth, and was on the stage and had to walk up and get an honorary degree. Another person at that time who was getting an honorary degree was Meryl Streep, and I think they were maybe it went in alphabetical order: Steinauer, Streep. And
nice.
there's a picture that is published in a book on the history of the Steinauer press, staged together, Rocky smiling from ear to ear, with Meryl Streep right by his side on the way to pick up their diplomas. And so that's my other Meryl Streep story.
Yeah, and I'm so happy.
You were asking, what does something like this cost?
Let me just give the parameters. So basically, let's say the customer wants to produce a short-ish book, a smallish kind of book, maybe soft cover. Maybe you could tell me sort of what a standard length should be, and the customer wants it to be a really beautiful, beautiful book. And I know that's a broad definition there, but they want it to be beautiful.
No, this is a question that comes up often. And my answer is, you can do a book for any price. It's just a question of what's going to be in that book. And actually, I brought some things to show you about that. If you do a simple stapled book, you do a stapled pamphlet, all black and white, no color pictures, and it's very short, that could be very, very inexpensive. That's about the least expensive. As a matter of fact, if it has a self cover, no separate cover, this one we did a color cover, so that was a little more expensive.
How much?
Well, that's a tough question. Every project is different. Can we get to that in a minute? Well, instead, I'd rather talk comparatively, but then I will try to answer your question.
Rough figures.
Well, I think as I talk more about the options. Now, the other side of the coin from this stapled single signature, just black and white, we did print one color on the cover for this one. If you do the other side of the coin to a hardcover book with color illustrations, that's 700 pages. Right. That's going to be much more expensive. So that's why I say you can do a book. Well, you can do a book for any price. Now, people often think the first thing people say is, "Oh, I have 20 pictures I have to get in there. It's going to be expensive." That actually, especially today, the way the technology of printing has gone, the number of illustrations is pretty minor compared to the number of pages. That this is an important concept that I always try to get across. There's nothing that adds to the price of the book like number of pages. Don't think number of illustrations will make a book more expensive because it adds pages to the books to fit them in. But nothing adds like number of illustrations, because number of pages, because when you have more pages, you have more paper, you have more plates, you have more printing forms, you even have more cost in binding for folding and sewing or folding and gluing extra signatures. So the main factor in the cost of books is number of pages. So if you come to me with a 16-page black and white self cover, not a separate cover, just 16 pages stapled, saddle wire, you could get that done for maybe, depending on how simple it is. We'll have to touch on number of copies, which I will right after this. Maybe we could do it for $500 to $1,500, let's say. I'm just throwing out a range. Every job has to be estimated individually. I never give a price without really getting the specs together. And that means I have to know the number of words, the number of illustrations, figure out how long it's going to run. So that's the least expensive end. But if you're doing, a 300-page hardcover book with, maybe some color, maybe not much, but a few color illustrations, it could run to 15, 20, 25,000, it could run to that. Now, there's the issue of quantity also. Quantity has much, much less to do with the cost of a book than number of pages. Again, number of pages is a big factor. But there's a big change in that over the past few decades, and that is the advent of what they call digital printing, which I'm sure you've heard of, or even print on demand. It used to be when I first went into business 25 years ago, there did exist some machines that could digitally produce a book. I wouldn't do a book digitally. The quality was so poor. And I'm not in this business to make mediocre or poor books. I'm in this business to make nice books. Doesn't have to be fancy. Doesn't have to be, handmade paper, letterpress with, 100 color illustrations. But even a pamphlet like this, I want to make a nice book. I don't want it to look like a Xerox product. But digital printing has come a long way. And I do a lot of it now for smaller runs. As a matter of fact, this book that I was mentioning earlier that I think should be picked up by a major publisher, but I have no approach about that now that David Godine has retired, is being done digitally. We're doing a very small run, under 100 copies digitally. So digital printing is actually quite good these days. But now that is all a question of quantity. If you get over 1,000 copies, for sure, it's actually going to be less expensive to print the book offset than digitally, almost always, because digital has very low startup costs, but every copy costs essentially the same. So with digital, if you do 300 copies of a book, it will literally cost you 3 times as much, almost 3 times as much as doing 100. Now, offset is the opposite. Offset, the startup cost is very high, but the run-on costs are very little. It's just the cost of the paper. Press time is negligible until you get into the Netherlands of quantity. So with offset, if you do 100 copies of the book, it'll cost you the same as 1. If you do 1 copy of a book, it's the same as 100.
Yeah.
And there's a point where offset becomes more economical than digital. And that number has been changing every day, if not every year. So it used to be 10 years ago, I think, that if you did under 1,000 copies, it was cheaper to do it digitally. Then it became 500 copies. Now, I don't know, maybe somewhere around 300 copies, that it's actually less expensive to do it offset than digital. But digital gives you the chance to do 50 copies, 100 copies of a book for a fairly reasonable price. Whereas it used to be that if it came to 50 or 100 copies, I'd say to people, just do 200. It'll cost you the same, which a lot of people realized was killing a lot of trees for books that weren't selling. And that's a point, too. And so they would cut their runs because they couldn't get distribution. So there's so many factors. And a lot of books, I figure, both digitally and offset. See if it's going to be less expensive one way or the other. I have sources that print very well in both. But a main point here is that digital has come a long way. Digital printing is much better. Now, I will add, I don't like the term digital printing, but I use it, as you've seen all the time, because all printing is digital to some extent. Offset uses a tremendous amount of digital technology now. So digital printing, what is digital printing? Well, let's not get into that. But there are machines that work electrostatically, or there are iris printers that do not use ink on paper, that are not ink or inkjet printing, which is another interesting term, which is not the standard offset lithography that books are printed. But one more thing, that if you go to Barnes & Noble and you pick up a novel, it's not printed digitally. It's guaranteed to be printed offset because of the quantity, because the publisher can't make money on a book if they don't sell 5,000 copies at least. So, and by that quantity, for sure, offset is more efficient.
So what about, like, again, here's me with my question. I want my book to be the most beautiful book possible. And let's say I want to, I don't know, I'm just ballparking. Let's say I want to do 300. What would you recommend?
What I would do if Nigel Beale or anyone else came to me with that question is I would price it. I would get estimates both ways, because you're on the, I think 300 is on the cusp of where it becomes more efficient one way or another. And then it becomes a question of, well, some other factors, let's say. And if you have a lot of, Nigel, if you have a lot of illustrations in your ideal book, you may want it to print offset for better quality illustrations, but still, digital has come a long way, as I said. Oh, okay. You reminded me of another thing. You're asking great questions, Nigel, as always, because one thing I like to say when people ask a question along those lines is, you want a beautiful book, what should I do? It may sound self-serving, but believe me, objectively, I'm going to tell you, there's nothing more important than the design of the book, not necessarily how it's printed. And
Jerry, that's why I'm talking to you.
Well, thank you, Nigel. Thank you. But that's the thing that, well-designed book. Digital, there are books I can pull off the shelf. I won't do it now. I won't take time. I can show it to you. You won't be able to tell. Most people, even I won't be able to tell without digging a little, whether it's digital or offset. But if you have good design for a book, it matters little how, it should be well produced. The material should be good. But really, design is a key. So get a good designer to work on your book is my advice.
Yes. Now you have to narrow that down, though. Okay, there's lots of good designers, but how do you find like the best designer for a book? Like, how do you do that?
Maybe I'll tell you another story in a minute. That's an interesting question. I never have to answer that question, because
of course not.
Because people are calling me.
Just do it yourself.
People don't call me and ask me, do you know a good designer for a book? People call me because they did their footwork like you're describing and found through someone mentioning it. I do no publicity for my business. I do no advertising. I don't have a website, Nigel. I do not. You cannot go on the web and find me. But somehow people are finding me, and I don't know how. I mean, they're probably asking other people.
It's through the Bibliophile podcast.
That's it. I wondered, especially back in 1985, I was wondering how they were finding me. And thank you, Nigel. So it's all word of mouth. I have had people who come to me and ask me to recommend designers. There are some designers who are my colleagues who are very good. I will say I'm not the only good designer out there. So they are out there. There's a customer I work for now who's become a tremendous publisher of fine editions, doing very special books. He's very successful, does a great job marketing these books, has a fantastic website.
Can you name him?
I will name him. Yes, I don't think it's Sunt Up Editions is the name. Go look up. So have you ran across that name?
What's it called again?
Sunt Up, SUNTUP, Sunt Up Editions, Sunt Up Press. No. Look at his website; it's fantastic. And he came to me. He has after we did a few books together. I did his first 6 or 12 books. I don't know how many. And he said, Jerry, I want to do 12 to 18 books a year. I got too many books for you to handle. You can't handle it. Can you give me the name of some other designers? And my first reaction was, no, I'm not going to give you the name of some other designers. I can handle it. I'll do it. This is all going on in my head. I certainly didn't say that to him, but it's all going on in my head. My second reaction was, this guy is very competent, very smart, very knowledgeable. He will find other designers, and that it's better for me, or better for his publishing too, frankly, for me to recommend a couple of other designers to him who I believe, I would even say I know are good designers, rather than have him come across someone who maybe would not be ideal, in my opinion, for his fine publishing enterprise. So I did. I recommend.
And Jerry, who are they?
Michael Russum and Mark Argetsinger. Now, you may have come across Mark. Did you come across Michael too?
I have. One of them came out with a beautiful big book on typography, right?
Correct.
And I've got it in storage anyway. I will interview him at some point.
Correct. He's come up, and you know who the publisher of that big, beautiful book on typography is?
Deigns.
Right. Practically the last book he published before he retired was that book, A Grammar of Typography. And it's a wonderful book.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, maybe when I'll send you the review I did of that book. It's a wonderful book. Right. So those were the two that I recommended to Suntup, to Paul Suntup. And he's used them and very successfully. They're excellent. But frankly, I can't remember turning down a job because I felt I was too busy. I feel like I could handle anything. And, it's when I started in business for myself, you know, Nigel, that for 10 years I worked for the Press of 8 Coalition. And then for 8 years I worked for the Steinauer Press. And then I went out on my own. And when I went out on my own and, if things got really busy, I would farm out some typesetting. I'd always do the design and supervise it and review it. But I would farm out some typesetting or even some layout work. And I had a colleague then, I don't think she's active now really as a book designer, who was a very successful book designer. I was just starting out. And I said to her, what do you do if you get too much typesetting work, and it's more than you can handle? She said, I get up an hour earlier in the morning. And you know something? She's 100% right. If you put in another hour here or there, it's amazing what you can absorb and get done. Yeah. So I understand that. So it's very rare. I do a lot of work for the Breuer Club, a wonderful institution. They really wanted to spread out the work so that it wasn't just Jerry Kelly. And I recommended Mark and, to Michael, I don't think has done much work for them. And there's another fellow, Misha Beletsky, who's a very good designer, and they've been doing some work for them. So there are other good designers in the world for sure.
Okay, well, let's just get back to my project. Let's say I'm thinking around 300. I'm thinking a kind of a smallish paperback and maybe a little series like that. And I'm thinking lovely covers.
Excellent questions. Now, Nigel, I'm going to be like a school teacher and say you weren't paying attention because I mentioned to you what the most important factor was.
Number of pages.
That's right. So nothing you just said tells me the number of pages. So what I would need first, but that's good because it gave us the chance to hammer home this point. I need to know the number of words and the number of pictures. And then I probably have a few more questions for you. So it depends. If you have 1,200, 1,500 words, it's going to be a very different answer to your question than if you have a 30,000 word text. It's going to be important. Now, a lot of times people can give me an electronic file, not count the words, but instead give me but of course you could count the words easily in a word processing program. You could calculate the words. So I need more. The first thing I do is get together information on what's going into the book, how much text, how many pictures. I need that. And frankly, I really have to design a book, basically design a book before I can estimate it. I have to figure out how many pages it's going to make, then I have to figure out type. Now, it used to be in the old days that I'm actually pretty good at math, and you had to be good at math to be a book designer because you had to cast off the manuscript, figure out how many pages it would make in a certain type style, different type styles run different lengths, the size, the leading, the margins, you had to figure all of that. I have to get together the specs, we call it, the specifications, the specs for the book. And to do that, I need information on how long you could actually send me a manuscript, an electronic file. I need to know if there are going to be any pictures or not. We would discuss the size. Do you want a 6x9 is a very economical size. And most reading books, I call them, are 6x9. Now, if you were to go to Germany in 1965, when book design was wonderful, or 1955, German book design, trade book design was fantastic. Most of their reading books were smaller.
I like those Zerkamp books.
Zerkamp did it, and Insel. But even the average, they did series that were, I think it may have been 4.5 by 7. I can imagine I have a bunch, but they were doing smaller books, which they could print more economically. Beautiful books.
Jerry, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do that.
Good. I'm all for it. So there are a lot of factors, but really I'd have to figure out the page count. At 300 quantity, you are probably at the cusp of whether offset or digital will be more efficient. Now, that also depends on illustrations, if you have color or not, which can be done both ways. I would probably estimate that book both ways. So the first thing I have to do is get an idea of what's in the book, how long the book's going to run, what size.
So let's say it's, I don't know, like what's the standard, 48 pages? Is that a...
Well, 16s, even 16s is standard, but 48 pages, that's an interesting concept. Do you know how many words you have? Because, if you have 30,000 words, it's going to be unreadable type at 48 pages.
It's small.
Yeah, 48 pages, you could probably get comfortably, well, you could probably get 12,000 words, maybe, maybe more. But if you have 25 pictures and 12,000 words, you're not going to get it. Are there any pictures in your book, Nigel?
There's going to be as many as there are people that I interview. So maybe let's say there's 3 or 4.
Okay. Now, you mentioned this as a series. Each book will have 3 or 4 pictures, or 1 or 3 or 4 per? Yeah, 3 or 4 pictures. Okay. Yeah. And can they be black and white, or can they be, or do you want color?
Ideally, I want color.
Okay, so color. By the way, also, 30, 40 years ago, if you mentioned color, you were talking a huge price difference. Now there's going to be a price difference, but it's not going to be as huge. And then it's a question of if we could get the color on one side of the sheet, on one form. Do you have a lot of flexibility in where the pictures appear?
Total.
Or do they have to be in a certain place in the book?
Total flexibility. Well, they have to be connected to the text of that interview, but aside from that.
Because if we're printing the book offset, let's say 6x9, and we're printing 16 pages up, your book would be 3 sheets through the press, or actually 1.5, because we print 16 pages on each side. Well, then if we could get that color all on one side of the sheet, it's the same as paying for one color illustration. But if they have to be in a very specific part, and one color illustration's on page 6, and another one's on page 28, and the last one's on page 46.
That's what I want to do, but we'll see.
Okay, so 3 color, and we call that scattered through the book, not where I have a lot of flexibility. And 48 pages, there comes the issue of binding. We should talk about this. 48 pages, you're on the cusp here for a lot of things. We can actually staple a 48-page book.
I don't want staple.
Good for you. Good for you. Now, after stapling, we have 2 choices, right? We have a sewn book, sewn in signatures, or a adhesive bind book, or the worst misnomer in the history of humankind, perfect bound, which is the most imperfect way of binding a book.
Here's what I love, and this is what I love that you've done, and that's Jonathan Hill's catalogues. I love those. I just love those.
Those are sewn books because this touches on the difference in price between sewing a book and adhesive binding it is surprisingly small. Well, I was going to say 90% of the books I do are sewn. But I'm going to go in a different route. I'd say 100% of the books I do are sewn, except some dealer catalogs, because those are ephemeral. There's some other books that have to be really, really, really cheap that I might adhesive bind. But otherwise, the difference in price is so little that I almost always sew a book and don't even give the customer that choice. But some dealer catalogs, a lot of dealer catalogs are considered ephemeral, that they will be thrown away. But Jonathan's, I'm just going to check one now.
They're for the ages, if you ask me. That's what I want mine to be.
And of course, having said that, did we sew? Yeah, they're sewn. Jonathan's catalogs are sewn. And a lot of, the catalogs I did for Glenn Horowitz, I think almost everyone was sewn. Gee, I hope I'm right about Jonathan's. Now, again, adhesive binding has come a long way. It's a lot better than it used to be. And there's something called glue, PURR glue, that is much better, that won't decay, that is much more flexible. So we could sew your book. Now, we're getting into some. Now, this is interesting, too. Digital printing. With digital printing, it's hard to get a sewn book. As a matter of fact, it's very difficult. A lot of the machines are set up only to impose books for perfect binding or adhesive binding. So digitally, you may not have a choice. If we go digital,
then I'll go offset at 500.
There you go. You're thinking right now, because 500 and 300 are not going to be much of a difference. But I will price that. I will price that both ways for you. 300 and 500, both offset and digital. And you could see, it would be a good exercise to see how the pricing works. Let's see. The cover of your book. What do you want on the cover of your book? Do you want a picture or do you want a typographic cover?
I need you as a master designer to convince me one way or the other.
Well, I love typography. If you're not married to some picture on the cover, this is a book I just did for the Groyer Club. And this is an interesting, this had a cover that was typed.
It's called The Classics in Translation, the Groyer Club. Yeah.
And this one's interesting too, because this was a very small edition, 60 copies. It was printed digitally because of that small run. And it was, I have to say, adhesive bound because, as I said, a lot of digital machines cannot handle a sewn binding. But I had the cover printed letterpress, 2-color letterpress. I wish you could see the physical artifact because letterpress, makes a wonderful impression. And we printed a 2-color letterpress. So, you hand the book to someone and immediately I must say, I think they, oh, wow, they could sense that it's something, even though the inside was done, this was done very inexpensively as a digital printing. This is a book I did with Glenn many years ago, and it had a 2-color letterpress cover also. But the inside, this is a good example. We had 1 halftone on the inside.
Yeah.
Thomas Merton.
Yeah.
And the rest of the book is type, which I love. I'm a typographer, so. But this was sewn. It was a sewn catalog. You also mentioned, I'll say this very specifically about your project. Most projects, this might not apply. But you said it's a series. This was a series I did for the Groyer Club. And the cover design is the same. We did this pattern of the Groyer Club arms, but we changed the color for every book in the series that we did. So it was a 2-color cover, which is inexpensive, just one color for the pattern and 1 color for the type, black for the type. The inside was just black type. This one had a halftone illustration, but most of them are unillustrated. Then there's this wonderful client I had who started a publishing company. The first book I did for her was a memorial book to a friend of hers. Marbled paper cover with a label. I must say,
that looks like those incel books.
Right, that had pattern paper covers. And I must say she loved that first book so much that she started a publishing company, publishing books that all of them had different marbled papers with a label. That was the common thread.
Who says you don't have an influence? Who says you don't make a difference?
Well, thank you, Nigel. So she published quite a few books. Bookman Press was the name of her company, Barbara Wars. But she was a published author, a successful published author, wrote a lot of young adult books that became, quite successful. But she wanted to publish her own books, both of her own work. I think only 2 or 3 of the books were her own work, and dozens of books of other people's writing that she admired. There's a wonderful story there, I must tell you, too, if I may, that she taught writing to, people who were interested in learning. She was, as I say, a successful published author. And a fellow, has a strange name. I think it was Simon Van Boy, Booy, I think was his name. And she published his first book. She loved his writing. He was a student of hers. And she loved his writing, and she published a book of his. Well, it turns out he became a very successful author. And you want to take a guess who's published his most recent book?
Probably Godine.
You're right. There you go. Godine. And I thought that's wonderful that it's come full circle like that.
You know what you've just done? By just making some very subtle suggestions, you put that idea of incel in my head, and I've already made up my mind now. We're
going to do a pattern paper?
Like incel. Because I just was in Berlin, and I went to Zerkampf, and I saw them, all of them, on their bookshelves in their offices.
Wow. And
to see them all together was just
wonderful.
Such a joy.
Well, Nigel, I love those books. The man who was the head of book design at Insel for decades was a man named Gothard de Beauclair, who is one of my heroes, one of the greatest book designers who ever lived. Hardly known in this country because he almost never did a book that was in English. And American book collectors don't buy books that aren't in English in general, but I have a great interest in German fine design, fine printing. But let's talk just a little more about that. I have hundreds of Insel Verlag books. Maybe I'll take a picture and send them to you of my Insel bookcase, ink bookcases. They're wonderful. And the man, Anton Kippenberg, who founded the company, he collected pattern papers. And he started using his own collection of pattern papers. And if you go to Leipzig, Germany, which is a wonderful book town, I don't know if you've ever been there.
I'll be there.
And you can go to the Museum of the Book in Leipzig, and they have a little area in this museum where they have these thin flat drawers that you could pull out, and it's his collection of pattern papers. Now, as time went on, they actually started commissioning pattern papers from various artists. So some of those pattern papers were originals by Fritz Cradle or Emil Pretorius, Werner Klemke, or these, wonderful contemporary artists of the book. And a lot of them were old papers that they reproduced that Kippenberg had gathered and that are still there in Leipzig, which used to be, before World War II, was the center of publishing in Germany and where Insel Verlag was located.
Yeah. Collectors, if they want to get English books, will just go to the King Penguins, which were modeled after them.
That's correct. 100% correct. They were modeled on the Insel, and the similarities are striking.
But one of the things that I also think this is connected is those beautiful Kerwin Press pattern papers by Enid Marx.
Yes.
And
right.
They're...
Right. Oh, I know them very well. As a matter of fact, if you look at Glenn Horowitz's catalog on Vita Sackville West, we copied one. I scanned one of those papers in. I hope that wasn't illegal. Maybe it was. But, we figured a British 1920s, 1930s author and, those Kerwin Press papers, what could be more appropriate? So, yes, and that's not the only time that I've used the Kerwin. So I'm very familiar with those. It wasn't only Enid Marx. There were other, I think Elizabeth Friedlander did a few. And, there were other artists.
Was Rebellious?
Rebellious did a few, right. Kerwin had a lot of connections with modern British artists of the early 20th century, and they commissioned those pattern papers. Yep, those are wonderful too. And so let's do a pattern paper. Now, will we do a one-color pattern paper, or which, like those Kerwin Press are almost always one color, not multicolored.
Yeah, if you want to make an impression, it's striking with the multicolors.
Yeah. Well, great. But I think that'd be, and for a series, it's wonderful because we could actually take the same scan and change the colors from title to title, or you could do a different pattern, like the Insel Verlags had a different pattern paper.
Yes,
but not for every book. There were times where they would use the same paper again. But 95% of the time they use a different pattern paper for every book.
For me, those Kerwin patterns and the Insel, I mean, to me, that's such a high point.
I agree with you 100%. As a matter of fact, I'm tempted to, but I don't want to interrupt this interview. I'm tempted to grab an Insel book and grab a book I did with Godin again and show you how we used one of the pattern papers from an Insel book for the cover of a Godin book. But you probably don't want me to interrupt the interview by that.
No, I want to continue it. The two of us. But what I think we've done here is we've sort of shown the start of the kind of conversation that you as a designer would have with me as a customer, and how wonderful it can get.
Yes, exactly. This is the kind of conversation. I won't speak about how wonderful or torturous it may be, but the first thing I would do is have a conversation like this, so you can take it a little further, and then get an estimate. But yes, a conversation like this. And where we agreed that, 6x9, I have this in my notes, 6x9 is what will make your book.
Not sure on that.
Oh,
I want to look at.
You want to do the smaller size? You want to do maybe 5x7, 4.5x7?
I want to look at that Zerkamp size there. I'm not 100% sure though.
Okay, well that's important. So we want to get the size down because size matters, as they say in the movies. And so, we want to get that. So let me know about the size. Oh, Now, Nigel, let's talk about another thing that often, if you want to make a nice paperback that's going to be a bit more than average, I often encourage flaps on the cover.
Yes, I love those. Yeah.
So do I. And if you look at Jonathan's catalogs that you mentioned, I always put, and again, it's more expensive, but it's something that makes a paperback look like a lot more than the average cheap book. Okay,
absolutely.
So we put flaps on the cover. Good. And then there were even jacketed paperbacks, but there was.
I might want to do that. Yeah, I might want to.
No, you can't. But this woman, Barbara Worsbrough, I mentioned to you, we always jacketed the covers for her books. We put a stiff. Now that's more expensive even than flaps on the cover. So we don't do that often because it's nice for some things, but a necessity, I wouldn't say so. Okay, so flaps on the cover. So that's another thing that we're putting into your specs. And I'm figuring nice cream uncoated paper. I only use archival good papers. Again, the price difference between a cheap, crappy paper and an inexpensive but good paper is very little. But when you mentioned, did you say Richard de Bas paper? I shuddered. Was that what you said? Or did you say, you meant, Saint-Amand? Did you say Saint-Amand?
Yeah.
I shuddered. That is expensive. That would really add. You were thinking for the cover only, I assume.
No. I'm just threw it out there. I don't.
That would really be expensive, Nigel. I would not price that for this book because it's going to be thousands of dollars in paper. The paper is going to cost multiples of what the rest of the production.
No. I just threw it out there. I mean, the other thing too is it's just so beautiful. It is, but it gets beat up pretty easily, and you want it to be functional, useful. I mean, not to put it down. It's so beautiful, but
well, you could do the covers letterpress on Saint-Amand paper. We could do that. And, that would not be that tremendously more expensive, but to do the text on Saint-Amand.
Oh, no. I wasn't thinking that.
We can do a cover. If you want to cover, I have done that. The samples I have here, I have done covers for inexpensive books. As a matter of fact, every once in a while I print them myself. I have a letterpress in the basement that I print covers. This here.
Yeah, but you can't put the pattern onto a really lush Saint-Amand paper. That's not going to look good, is it?
No. You mean to print it? Well, one thing is you'll be covering it. You'll be taking away a lot of the appeal of the paper by covering the whole paper with padding. You could do it, actually. I'll say, but it would be very expensive. See, offset, another thing about offset is there's a tremendous amount of waste in offset. If you're printing 300 copies of your book, the offset printer is going to start with 600 sheets of paper or more. A lot of waste to get the press adjusted, to get the color up, as they say. Whereas letterpress uses much less waste. So a lot of times I do letterpress covers. This book, you won't be able to see it if we were together. This book has a Hahnemuller paper cover. This was an inexpensive catalog for the Grolier Club. It had one halftone. The rest of it is type, just black type.
Yeah.
But to make it nicer, if you could hold this, it's a Hahnemuller mold-made paper. And I printed the cover in brown type on my letterpress in the basement, sent it to the binder. So we could do that. We could take a Saint-Amand paper. I have done that. There's a Sheridan Lord book, little memorial book. There was more than one Sheridan Lord book I did for Glenn Horowitz. But his memorial book, a little booklet, had a Saint-Amand paper cover, printed letterpress in my basement. We could do that. And, at 300 copies, if we printed it letterpress, maybe look into that. Sure, why not? If you have your heart set on it.
No, I don't. I don't necessarily.
I could do that very inexpensively, print letterpress in my basement. And I do a lot of covers letterpress.
That sounds interesting. Well, plus getting the hand of the master actually on the book. This is good. This is good, too. Well, okay, so let's just, if we're winding down this, basically it's kind of like a client, not quite a sales call, but because this client is sort of sold already, you don't have to persuade him, but how would you wind this down then? What would you say?
Well, I want to make sure I have all the specs, the papers we're going to use, like we just discussed, the cover paper, but also text paper, the size, the number of pages. Most of the time, people don't give me a page count. They give me a word count and a number of pictures. But I'm going to take your word that this will fit into 48 pages. And then I will prepare an estimate. And in your case, again, since we're at the cusp, 300, 500 copies of offset versus digital, I'll prepare an estimate two ways. When I give you the estimate, I'm going to give you variations, but also two prices. I always price the design and typesetting separately from the paper, printing, and binding. I'll give you those two. I'm a very inexpensive designer. I know what I charge very little for design, but I don't use the cheapest printers. I use good printers who are good value for the money. I always feel you're getting a lot for your dollar with the printers that I work with. But I do give two separate prices so that people can see, what part of it is design. That being said, I can't remember a customer ever telling me, well, go ahead, design it and I'll get it printed. I don't think that's ever happened. But I break it down for you. And then I'll give you two quantities in your case of maybe two different cover options. Discussion like we just had about what's going into the book. But you have to let me know the size. I won't do the estimate before you consider the size a little more, whether you want 4.5 by 7 or 6 by 9. That's still up in the air. So we'll have to settle that.
Okay. And so let's leave now, and then we'll reconvene and we'll do another interview, basically looking at once we've gotten a bit of pricing in there, and I've thought a bit more about it, and you have too.
Can you give me 30 seconds, Nigel? There's one thing I wanted to.
Sure. Yeah.
I'll be right back.
Yeah.
What I want to do, Nigel, is I want to measure these Insel books, but they're all the same size. And I was doing 4.5 by 7 off the top of my head. I want to see. Well, there you go. 4.5 by 7 it is. Boy, I'm proud of myself. These are 4.5 by 7. So okay, when you consider these beautiful.
Oh, they're stunning.
Like I said, I have hundreds of them. Hundreds. I love these.
So yeah. Some early Godine poetry books looked a lot like that.
Yes, he did. No, they were all pattern paper covers designed by Stephen Harvard, who worked at Steinauer. The early ones were printed at Steinauer. David is a marvelous publisher and a marvelous bookman overall, a collector, a publisher, a scholar of books. So he knew, and he, I'm sure, was the one who thought, I'm going to do pattern papers with a label. They all had a label design on the front. Yes. The King Penguins were modeled on the Insel, and they even got a German designer, Jan Schickold, who designed them. Yeah. So yes, these had a great influence. But the German book design of the 20th century is fantastic, really.
Well, I'll direct listeners to that early interview I did with David on the 40th. I'll go after and get that book, his 50th.
Godine at 50. Wonderful book.
And try and convince him to come back on the show, and then we'll reconvene.
Great.
So thank you,
Nigel.
Such a
pleasure
great conversation. Lovely. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Okay, get back to me about the size of your book, and then I'll get started on the estimates.
Very good. Okay, thanks so much again.
My pleasure. Take care.
Okay, you too. Jerry Kelly is an American book designer and an expert on calligraphy and typography. Thanks again. Bye.